Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I hope everyone can hear me. If at any point the sound drops, please let me know. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you this evening, even though it's later here than it is in New York right now. But I will just dive right into it. I hope the fact that this is a remote lecture is not too disconcerting. Um, okay. So to give an outline of what I'll be talking about over the next 40, 45 minutes, um, I won't be focusing too much on explaining the technicalities of blockchain technology or on smart contracts and so on in this talk, given that I believe the next speaker will be going into more depth in explaining this. I have primarily two objectives, which you can see in the outline of this lecture as well. The first is exploring the concepts of solidarity, trust, and confidence. Now, the reason why this is important is indicated by this rather cryptic set of numbers and alphabets that you can see on my slide. And this is basically what was the genesis block of the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, ostensibly, this is just a timestamp. It's providing a headline which shows that the blockchain was actually started on this given date, and they used a headline to prove this. So, I'm, of course, talking about Nakamoto here. But really, you can also read this text as a sort of meta commentary on trust and governance. So trust is important in both the discussion regarding blockchain, but obviously when we talk about solidarity and cooperativism, it is also essential as well. And when we are thinking of what I will call the paradox of reconciling blockchain libertarianism with solidarity, the issue of trust is crucial in this. So that is the first objective, is to explore these concepts in a bit more detail. Then the second objective is to discuss two particular cases in which cooperatives are making use of blockchain or blockchains or distributed ledger technologies. The reason for these two objectives is to unpack this apparent paradox, and secondly, to see if there is some way in which these cooperatives are trying to dissolve this paradox. Now, this lecture will include research from my research fellowship at the New School, as Trevor kindly mentioned, as well as ongoing research I'm now doing with Primavera de Filippi of the Harvard Berkman Klein Center of Internet and Society and CIRSA, as well as with Vessel Ryers at the European University Institute and some others, on understanding blockchain as a confidence machine rather than as a trustless or a trust-free technology. So I think it's appropriate to begin this discussion by talking about what is meant by a solidarity economy. Now, at this stage of your course, you've already become familiar with a lot of examples of this. And I think it's worthwhile to delve a little bit more into some of the conceptualization of both solidarity economies and the concept of solidarity itself. So when we think of a solidarity economy, the ILO, for instance, defines it as essentially being the pursuit of an economic activity, but being guided by principles and practices related to participation, democracy, sustainability, and solidarity. You will notice that this definition, while talking about a solidarity economy, uses the word solidarity in it without defining it. And that is why it becomes important to actually investigate and interrogate this term itself. And I think part of the reason why many definitions that you'll find of solidarity, especially in official documents like those produced by the ILO, a sort of vagueness regarding solidarity is because there have been different traditions and different uses of the term. You can see civic republican conceptions of solidarity, Marxist conceptions of solidarity, anarchist conceptions of solidarity, Catholic conceptions of solidarity, and so on. Now, in terms of organizations, it's usually quite clear which ones we are talking about. It of course includes cooperatives, the subject of this course and of this lecture, but it also includes mutual societies. It includes foundations, associations, and other nonprofit entities as well. Now, to interrogate the idea of solidarity a little bit more, and to use to start off with a discipline which is close to cooperative business, if we look at critical management studies, a definition that has been proposed there of solidarity is that it is shared membership characterized by mutual care and mutual respect that is a sense of belonging enriched by a commitment to human dignity, to love one's neighbor as oneself. In other words, we see true solidarity, among other things, involving the existence of trust. And you'll notice again that I'm using the word trust quite deliberately and trying to emphasize this, because this becomes again relevant when we will be turning to blockchain in particular. And this solidarity has been equated by some as being the equivalent of trust. So when McNeil, the person I cite in these slides, when McNeil says that solidarity can be equated with trust, he sees solidarity as being a state of minds, a belief not only in the future peace among those involved, but also in future harmonious cooperation. Now, what is left unsaid by this is that solidarity is contingent. If we think of the work of the liberal philosopher Richard Rorty, he, contra to Hannah Arendt, was skeptical of the idea of universal solidarity. He thought that the idea of universal solidarity was unworkable because we consciousness, when we think of humanity as a whole, was quite weak. He believed that our frame of solidarity is relatively narrower, smaller, and more local. And but that does not mean that he thought that this should be the case, normatively speaking. He believed that our frame of solidarity should be expanded and embody a type of inclusive solidarity. And an inclusive solidarity requires the existence of self-doubt. Because if we do not have self-doubt about our own sensitivity to the pain of others, we do not doubt in existing institutional arrangements, and we do not have curiosity about alternatives, then it is not possible to have inclusive solidarity. And so these ideas about being sensitive to the pain of others and being able to imagine alternatives becomes core to understanding inclusive solidarity. And this has been in a more recent PhD thesis by Hunt Hendricks at Princeton University, is also what guides her understanding, or what she sees as a common framework or common theme within the solidarity research she did, that it involves the search for alternatives and a rejection of a world comprised of primarily self-centered, atomized individuals. Again, for those of you who have been on this course for a while, or those of you who sort of intuitively understand what solidarity means, this might resonate with you. By way of a sort of personal anecdote, the image that I shared on this slide is of a worker-occupied and recuperated factory in the province of Buenos Aires that I had the fortune of visiting in 2017. And there again, we see that solidarity was quite prominently was prominently displayed on the walls of the building where they worked in the workplace itself, as a sort of constant reminder of what their values are. So that appropriately brings me to talking about cooperatives in particular as a type of solidarity business. Cooperatives, particularly worker cooperatives, embody solidarity, in my view, in three main ways. Um, they are quite typically motivated by social justice. That is a common theme. But to be more concrete about this, we can see three related types of solidarity. One can be considered community solidarity, which is the recognition that a workplace is embedded in the community in which they operate and are situated. And this means that along with being concerned about, for instance, the work that is happening within a factory or a given workplace, they're also concerned by societal and environmental and even cultural well-being of the local community. And in addition to this, it also requires the development of a common set of values as cooperators. And sort of as an aside from the examples that I gave of a worker recuperated factory, there's been recent ethnographic research, for instance, that looks at the role of humor in trying to understand how cooperators are able to prevent hierarchies emerging within a flattened workplace. So again, looking at common sets of values, looking at how humor plays a role in this, all of this can contribute to this idea of consciousness, a cooperative consciousness, and this is also essential for solidarity amongst cooperators themselves. Thirdly, you have the idea of class solidarity. So in the case of a worker cooperative, for instance, it would be the recognition of your worker interest as a class. And while this might seem also quite intuitive, as I think this is also something that shouldn't be taken for granted, given that cooperatives often face numerous challenges, and even a brief perusal of the literature on worker cooperatives and why worker cooperatives struggle in developing, we can find some prominent examples emerging again and again, regardless of which jurisdiction we talk about. They range from, of course, financing difficulties, but also to maintaining democratic participation, and even, curiously in some cases, a conflict between unions and cooperatives. And so this issue of class solidarity is, again, something that should not be taken at face value. In some jurisdictions like Quebec, cooperative legislation facilitates this balancing of multiple stakeholder interests, including the community, through a bespoke legal entity called a solidarity cooperative. And one particular aspect, which is, I think, quite interesting in this regard, is that a lot of the literature that looks at cooperatives as solidarity entities notes that when we speak of solidarity cooperatives, we are thinking of whether they are locally rooted or not. Now, this is a particular point to note when we speak of blockchain, which is, of course, globally distributed. Now, if we focus now, we turn our attention from looking at cooperatives in particular to looking at blockchain technology, we find that many, but not all, of the early advocates of blockchain technology espoused libertarian values. Now, this is especially true of the Bitcoin blockchain and those who used Bitcoin, but this perception has sort of become common regarding all blockchains and all distributed ledger technologies. We see that in this book cover that I shared on this slide, we see that game theorists, especially game theorists who considered situations of conflict like a war or even a nuclear scenario, were very influential in the early development and thought process of some of the most influential blockchain developers that we have today. So game theorists such as Thomas Schelling influenced persons like the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin. And in turn, as I will be explaining a little bit later, this influenced Kleros. And as this title suggests, much of the thinking behind these essays is premised on the incentives of blockchain technology being affected by impossible or improbable situations in which people will communicate. So the idea being that as there exists a lack of communication, a lack of trust, there needs to be a way of being able to overcome this. And the creation of incentives or other mechanisms to be able to do that. Now, the prominence of Bitcoin has helped create this impression that all blockchain and distributed ledger technologies and those who develop and use them share the same politics as those who adhere to a sort of libertarian ideology. And that this particular politics that they share is primarily driven by a desire for personal enrichment, is a type of right-wing libertarianism, and potentially seeks the pursuit of illegal activities. For some, blockchain as a whole are seen as an extension of neoliberal capitalism without really distinguishing the different types of blockchains, the different uses and ends, and the different purposes for which it could be deployed. Now, this impression has been reinforced by the design of several prominent blockchain protocols, which in terms of their crypto-economic incentives are driven by self-interest. So the self-interest of miners or delegates for a block reward. I will be talking about Ethereum and the EOS protocol in a couple of slides. And that's particularly one of the criticisms or one of the thoughts behind this as well. And there's also claims that and this is not only with Bitcoin, the claim that the need for interpersonal trust is displaced by these technologies. And in my view, this presents a very peculiar paradox. If solidarity, and I'll read this because I think it's clearer if I do so, if solidarity is premised on trust, personal risk, local familiarity, and consideration of mutual well-being, then how can organizations that seek to cultivate a solidaristic enterprise, such as a cooperative, including worker cooperatives, how can they do so while using a technology that involves a global community and is premised on mutual suspicion and the displacement of trust? So the paradox being between solidarity and this idea of trustlessness, when solidarity seems to be intimately tied to the concept of trust, at least from the literature that I've mentioned so far. Now, I should, at this point, introduce some corrections to this narrative. Kostakis, Bowens, and others have been documenting examples of distributed ledger technologies and blockchains that embody solidaristic values, such as mutual cooperation and the acknowledgement of care work through consensus mechanisms, that using consensus mechanisms other than proof of work, which is one of the consensus mechanisms which you could see as being self-interested in. Through the introduction of governance systems that are different from one which, let's say, has a very light touch approach to dealing with many governance questions. So to think a bit more deeply about governance questions. And they've also looked at examples of entirely new protocols that are emerging. And I've cited on these slides some that might be of interest to this audience. In addition to what I've already presented here, one example that is a very interesting one is the first Vermont-based, Vermont-registered blockchain-based limited liability company called DORG, or DORG. which is a software development and design worker cooperative, but registered as this unique new legal entity. And one of the innovations that it has is that it uses reputation-based voting. So it deals with the issue of, instead of having one member, one vote, it is able to adjust decision-making rights based on an individual's reputation. And that's one of the sort of novel governance systems that it is trying to use. This is all relatively new, so whether the success of this is yet to be determined. The other that is mentioned here is the Guerrilla Media Collective, and there is also Holochain. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of these examples in great detail. I will focus mainly on Eva and Kleros, as mentioned in my outline. In addition to these examples that have been documented over the last few years, including quite recently, there's also a blossoming interest in distributed participatory governance. And this includes developing particular tools that can facilitate this, for instance, co-budgeting tools, so that in a decentralized manner, people around the world are able to build a transparent budget with each other, as well as experimenting with many different types of voting systems or other types of consensus building mechanisms, one of which I will be talking about later when I talk about juror selection in Kleros. Now, in addition to all of this, like there are these examples of alternative blockchains, alternative distributed ledgers. There are tools and voting systems that are emerging. I think there is a possibility of also exploring a broader hypothesis regarding what blockchains are able to offer. And that is that while several blockchains can, try to render interpersonal trust necessary, what they are trying to replace this with is with confidence. And this concept is distinct from that of trust. And I will explore that in a little while. The reason why this is important is that our hypothesis, and my hypothesis, because I'm the one defending this here, my hypothesis is that while on-chain mechanisms can help improve confidence, it will be typically off-chain mechanisms that will contribute to building trust. And as I will argue, both of them are required, and they both mutually reinforce each other. So now this gives me an opportunity to get into the meat of today's lecture and present two particular case studies. I believe some of you have had the opportunity at least to look at the more detailed explanation of Eva that I've presented in the required reading for today's lecture. But I will go over a little bit about this and focus on particular issues that I think are salient for the topic of today's lectures about solidarity and the use of blockchain by Eva. So as you might have heard earlier in this course, or you might be familiar because of the fact that it's quite a famous example of a platform cooperative, Eva is in the business of ride sharing, but it's very different from the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, in the sense that it is grounded in the values of solidarity, sustainability, and decentralization. The idea of Eva emerged essentially among two young Canadian students when they realized that the extractive model of Uber was undesirable, but there were a lot of benefits to the technology that companies like Uber were developing. And so they set out with what I would say are 5 main objectives. Their objectives were to lower intermediary fees, to try to maximize financial benefit for drivers, to be able to confer governance rights to users, to protect the privacy of both drivers and riders, and to try to achieve a sort of glocalism, in the sense that you operate locally and target work on local markets, but on certain questions, such as the development of technology, you think globally. Now, while these sound very reasonable as objectives, of course, implementing this in practice is a real challenge. And what they did to do this is that they, started working themselves. They put their, their own blood, sweat, and time into working on this project, and they developed a white paper, which, for good or for bad, has emerged into something quite different from what that white paper initially was. The white paper, for instance, is no longer online, but it, for instance, imagined a very broad role for what the blockchain protocol would be used for. Ultimately, the way that blockchain is now being used by EVA is much more limited than was originally imagined in the initial white paper. The other big difference is that they imagined initially that there would be a non-profit foundation that would be the owner of the technology that EVA develops, but this has now been replaced, or in its function has been now replaced. It still exists. Its function has been replaced by EVA Global Corporation. EVA Global Corporation is the developer and legal owner of the technology that EVA develops, and all of the cooperatives that use it acknowledge this. And you can see this in the contracts and the bylaws of, for instance, the Solidarity Cooperative EVA in Montreal, that the owner of the technology is EVA Global Corporation. And in the future, as they try to expand internationally, this will become very important as well, because there will be issues of both maintaining the quality of the technology, but also the integrity of EVA's brand name as it seeks to globalize. Now, initially, again, in the white paper, it was imagined that this global corporation would receive 5% of the transaction fees that would be incurred during an ordinary ride-sharing transaction. The difference being between what EVA and others would charge in this respect is that, as I mentioned, they would try to charge a lower fee than competitors. And so the maximum they could charge would be 15%. And of that 15%, up to 5% would be given to EVA Global Corporation. And this would be for maintaining servers, for licensing purposes, for instance, licensing from Google Maps to use that they use in their application. I should add, because I quite quickly went over what ride sharing is in here, but the functionality of EVA as a ride sharing application is not all that different from an Uber or Lyft in terms of the experience of a rider trying to call for a ride. And this is quite interesting, because one of the purposes that EVA has tried to achieve is to create a seamless experience in which the rider is not aware that they are using a blockchain protocol, specifically the EOS protocol. And the way they did this is by not requiring riders to have a crypto wallet, and not requiring payments in a cryptocurrency. You can pay with a credit card. And so for an ordinary user who isn't familiar or isn't even interested in blockchain or distributed ledger technologies, it becomes sort of invisible to them. And as I said, the fact that EVA has not issued a token only adds to this. Of course, the reason behind this was that at the time when EVA was being developed, there were a lot of crackdowns and also warning letters being sent by various securities regulators about token issuances, which caused some companies or some projects to become a bit cautious about the issuance of tokens. But regardless of this, perhaps it is to its benefit for now that it is able to attract both drivers and riders who do not need to be savvy in terms of crypto technology. Now, there are two other particular points that I would like to focus on. One is the particular type of protocol that they use, and the other is about the cooperative that they have and the way they are trying to expand their reach. The protocol they use is a permissioned sister chain that is forked from the EOS protocol. What this essentially means is that EVA as an entity has quite a degree of control over this particular sister chain. And the reason that they opted for EOS over another blockchain like Ethereum is because they felt that it had relatively low latency and again could be customized so that it is unobtrusive in the way that I mentioned. The real reason that they still are using blockchain, because you might be wondering if it doesn't have a token and if it isn't being used for this sort of crypto economic incentive in that way, then what is the real use case for a blockchain here? It's that is of privacy preservation. So the idea is that only a minimal amount of personal information is collected from users, include both riders and drivers, only to the extent that it is needed by relevant local laws. So of course, a driver has to go through a certain amount of checks, criminal background checks and so on before they are able to drive for EVA. And they have to, in that process, divulge a certain amount of personally identifiable information. But one, that is only divulged to the relevant cooperative. And second, it's only to the extent that the law requires it. What happens afterwards is that the information that is collected by EVA is anonymized. And this anonymized data can be used by, for instance, municipal authorities to see the traffic data of a particular city like Montreal. They're able to also understand whether there is congestion, for instance, in certain areas. For drivers, this anonymized data can also help in understand their relative performance compared to other drivers. And quite importantly, and again, a big distinction between what EVA does with what an Uber or Lyft does, the global corporation of EVA does not see the member data that the cooperative has. Now, at the moment, there isn't a big separation between the two, but as we can see that EVA will scale, we can imagine that as cooperatives start operating in other parts of the world, this preservation of the this anonymity of member data, or this separation of member data from the data that is visible to the global corporation, is a unique virtue of EVA. Now, this brings me to a point regarding the international expansion of this, because at an initial stage, you can imagine that cooperatives might try to incubate other cooperatives in another part of the world. So if you have a ride-sharing cooperative in Montreal, you would first try to expand to other parts of Canada and then to another part of the world. Perhaps having some sort of group structure like a company does, where they own each other as parents and subsidiaries. This did not happen in the case of EVA. Instead, what they are now planning is that they will use a franchise model. So if you think of the McDonald's of the world, instead of it being a commercial franchise, it will be a social franchise. A social franchise is one in which, along with an economic activity, an economic objective, the franchisor and the franchisee are also trying to pursue social objectives. And the advantage of this is that it relies on local franchisees, potential franchisees, to do a lot of the work themselves, for instance, complying with local regulations regarding transport. And in the case of a blockchain-based system like EVA's, they would also have to have become a block producer of the AOS protocol. They would have to run a node. They would have to run a web server. They would have to use some of EVA's brand information and emails. And they would be able to also look at, use some of EVA's technology to gather business intelligence. For instance, how many failed rides happened during a particular period of time in a given city. So those would be all of the both the business plan and the technological issues that a franchisee would have to deal with. And what the franchisor would do was to provide this template and this technology, and in return receive this transaction fee of 5% that I mentioned. Now, on a very final point about EVA, the issue that some have with this is that you still have the issue that EVA is at the moment an entity which the global corporation is those who founded it, and there is no electoral accountability mechanism as was originally imagined in the white paper. But on the other hand, the Solidarity Cooperative EVA in Montreal does have quite an elaborate governance system. So it has 5 classes of members, worker members, driver user members, rider user members, investor members, both corporate and individual. Investor members can get preferred shares on which they get interest, and they have to hold the shares for 3 years. And they also can get patronage based on the amount of transactions they have with EVA. Worker members get to elect 2 directors onto the board. As far as I know, I think one has been elected recently. And the other classes of members can each elect 1 director. Electronic voting is possible, which you can imagine in this sort of ecosystem. Not everyone can turn up at a meeting all the time. And the General Assembly is able to determine if there will be a distribution of surplus in a given year. EVA at the moment has some 20,000 passenger members, over 500 driver user members. I'm not sure if it's close to 1,000 yet, and over 50 supporter members. So it's really growing at an exponential rate, considering when it launched just last year. That allows me at that point to go into the second example. I will look at the time. Yeah. So the second example that I will look at is that of Kleros. Now Kleros is a business that is a project that that arbitrates online disputes in a decentralized manner by calling on a pool of globally dispersed jurors through a self-selection and sortition process. Sortition is a type of random sampling. There are the relevant legal entities here are the main cooperative Kleros, SCIC, and what the cooperative Kleros does is that they develop the interface that jurors use and the main technology. And for now, a lot of the responsibility and ownership still rests with Kleros. I want to briefly give you an example of how this works, even though, of course, I'm not talking at great length about the merits of this particular case. But imagine you have a smart contract between 2 parties that are using an Ethereum blockchain. and they have opted into this jury system that I mentioned. And let's say there's a dispute. Let's say the quality of a web page or a graphic is not up to scratch, and the person who paid for it or wants to pay for it is upset with this. So they trigger a dispute. A deposit is then paid from both parties, for instance, 0.5 ether from each, and that's put into an escrow. And at that point, they can also say that we want to have 3 or 5 or however many jurors in this process, and those 3 or 5 jurors pledge a certain amount of Kleros' native token, which is called Pinakion, in order to be a juror. And then there is a random selection, but the more Pinakion that is staked raises the chance of someone being selected to be a juror. Jurors that are selected also deposit an amount of Pinakion in escrow, and they then, after the selected jurors have deposited this amount, they receive the evidence to review. For instance, the quality of the graphic. They receive all the communication between the parties to see whether what the truth is in this context. They then vote on the outcome, and each juror then gets a fee, irrespective of what the outcome is, whether in whose favor it is in, and they get this from the deposit of the losing party. And the winner, let's say the one who commissioned the graphic, they get their deposit back. The juror that didn't vote with others, for instance, let's say there were 3 jurors, and instead of it being unanimous, one juror lied, quote unquote, because even though it was objectively wrong, they decided to say that the graphic was fine. They would then lose their deposit to the other jurors. And the reason that this incentive mechanism exists is because Kleros wants to incentivize economically people to tell the truth. That would be the only way that they can ensure that their jury system works. Finally, as you'd imagine, it's possible to have specialized disputes. So juries can join, let's say, a software development court, subcourt, or a graphic design subcourt. And it is also possible to appeal the decisions that are arrived at in the first instance in these arbitral disputes. Now, saying all of this, you can imagine that to create such a court, you have to create several applications. You have to create an escrow. You have to create the court itself. You have to create an oracle to be able to gather data from outside of the blockchain ecosystem to be able to bring it on chain. Who has ownership of this? At the moment, the control rights on technical matters is held by this cooperative Kleros, an SCIC, which my research fellow Jonas told you last week, is a French cooperative entity. And that cooperative, which relative to the size of Kleros' ecosystem has a relatively small membership, decides on these sorts of issues. The organizational rights of Kleros, though, can be held by anyone. So if you go onto their website, almost anyone who is, let's say, an end user, a juror, an intermediary who has plugged in Kleros' court system, other token holders, anyone can join the cooperative. But as of now, it is the cooperative that has these rights. What is interesting, and this relates to, again, the point of trust and confidence, is that at the moment, they are planning on changing who has control over certain technical matters. So they want to, instead of relying on, let's say they want to change how much a juror is paid from being, let's say, 0.5 ether per dispute to 0.7. They now have decide on these sorts of questions on Aragon, and which is a separate domain. I won't go into this, but they decide that on Aragon, and then Kleros, the cooperative, has to implement this. What they are now suggesting is that they were going to create a smart contract for the Kleros governor, which can be directly triggered, let's say, by processes that take place in Aragon. And the advantage of this is that you then have everything happening on chain, and that you do not have a reliance on the goodwill of Kleros Cooperative to actually change, let's say, the amount that is paid to jurors. The reason that this is, I think, an interesting example also of being able to build solidarity is because of the fact that you can imagine that these sorts of disputes about content moderation, about freelancing, about e-commerce can happen in a globally dispersed environment where trust otherwise might be low and might often involve people in precarious positions. And so having this sort of dispute resolution mechanism can be an amicable way in dealing with this. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to start wrapping up. So one of the claims that I'd like to make in this is that improvements on-chain governance mechanisms, such as the creation of a smart Kleros governor, can be seen as a mechanism to enhance confidence. Confidence, which is sometimes referred to as system trust, is a distinction that is made by the systems theorist and lawyer Niklas Luhmann, where he says that confidence derives from past experience, including past performance, about how a technology works properly. And in doing so, it forecloses the possibility of choice and of risk-taking. This is in distinction to the concept of interpersonal trust, which relies on the existence of uncertainty and risk-taking. One of the ways of thinking about this, because this can seem quite esoteric, is by thinking of it as in terms of addressability. While individuals and organizations can be addressed by a letter, a technological system or money or the law cannot be addressed in such a manner. Now, confidence and trust are two concepts which mutually reinforce one another. An important mechanism for building confidence is having effective and potent expert systems. And of course, an expert system can be, for instance, the bar. But to have confidence in the bar, you need to have trust in lawyers. And so we can see that there is this interplay between these two concepts. But if an expert system works properly, we can obviate the need for trust in many instances. So to provide a more, also another simple example of this, if you imagine that if you have a licensed plumber, because you have confidence in the expert system that gave the license to this plumber, you do not need to trust the plumber to do their plumbing. However, you would need to trust the plumber if you gave your baby to be babysat by that plumber, which you have no idea if they're qualified to do or not. And so the issue of uncertainty becomes very important here. And if you remember what I said about rorty and doubt, we can again start seeing that the idea of trust seems to be more linked to the idea of solidarity than to confidence. But perhaps we need to take another view of solidarity. So Hannah Arendt said that solidarity is not based on sentiment, but it is rather a commitment to abstract ideas and ideals. For instance, the idea of greatness or honor or dignity. And that this is spurred by actions that are founded on and informed by facts. And and if we see this conception of confidence, maybe, and we think of solidarity in this sense, then maybe we can think of the fact that the on-chain mechanisms being introduced by these projects are more akin to an action-oriented type of solidarity. This is an example of one of the on-chain governance mechanisms that are happening on Aragon right now regarding Kleros, and you can see the different proposals taking place there, just to show an example of how they try to build confidence in this particular system. But to come closer to a close on this point, as must be clear by now, blockchain systems are like socio-technical assemblages. They involve a range of actors from core developers to miners to drivers and jurors. There are having confidence in this overall system means having trust in all of the actors that are in this system. Now, the invariable need for trust is why governance is so critical. And this is both at the protocol layer, but also at the application layers, such as with EVA and Kleros. And for applications in particular, cooperative governance offers control mechanisms for members such as users to hold founders and core developers to account. For example, through voting, to getting disclosures, by asking questions. And this, in turn, addresses the issue of trust. And by addressing this issue of trust, you start building confidence in higher order expert systems. For instance, if we start thinking of core developers and being a type of expert system. So while addressing the issue of trust in this manner through cooperative governance, we can also decouple cooperative governance from the governance of technology itself through the use of on-chain processes, such as the way in which now the votes that are made on the Aragon can be directly implemented through the Kleros governor into the Kleros governor smart contract into the smart contract of the Kleros court, bypassing the Kleros cooperative and trying to not have a centralized point of failure. This by doing this on-chain process may increase predictability. And as if you recall at this point, increasing predictability in this sense increases confidence. And this mutual reinforcement might be enough to be able to deal with the issue of this particular paradox of how to reconcile solidarity with trustlessness. So having confidence and trying to build confidence and having some mechanisms that can address the issues of trust that continue to exist in blockchain systems might be able to dissolve the paradox. So finally, blockchains are protean technologies. They may be designed and deployed for a wide variety of purposes. They don't necessarily have to conform to a particular right to libertarian ideology. There are several solidaristic enterprises